It looks like Ela frightened a few people away. These are, if you didn't get a copy of the handout last time, these are some extras that I printed out. This does all 16. The gestalting of them. All the people who didn't get any, we're not going to use them this time, but all the people who didn't get any didn't come this time. All right. Our little prayer group that meets here on Sunday night has a seasonal song fest every year, and it's at 3021 Winona Way, and it's a grand thing. There are several piano players that show up, and there's all kinds of goodies and all kinds of conversation. Maybe as many, sometimes there are puppet shows or things like that, and sometimes as many as 50 or 60 people coming and going. It goes on between 2 and 5. It's a lovely bunch of people, and if you're interested in attending, it's free to anyone who has anything to do with microcosm or not. And relatives and... All right. We're working on looking at or examining the broad general characteristics of a horoscope. We can spend the whole year doing that before we go to the deeper analysis. And we're hoping that by looking at this broad perspective, we won't lose the bigger picture when we start getting into deeper things, because sometimes when you get into deeper things and you start penetrating into them, you get blinded by looking at that one thing, and we're hoping to have a really good, broad understanding before we get going. There are some copies of the handouts from last time in case you didn't get one. Okay. And we're doing this by an age-old method of looking at horoscopes and making tests. So far they've been distribution tests, and from those tests drawing profiles. And the tests and profiles that we're drawing, we're working from vague and very broad to more and more specific. We have just finished the most vague test and profile, which is just a general looking at a distribution in space, which we called astrological gestaltism. Gestaltism is actually originating about 130 years ago, and astrological gestaltism probably started with Mark Edmund Jones about 50 or 60 years ago. Now we're going to start discussing attitude profiles. When we do this, again, the planets are going to be the focal determiners. The reason for that is that is what the function of planets are, what the function of planets is in astrology. The planets focus. They focus dynamically. As things are going on, then there's a different background behind them. They focus energies. Or they get into aspects with other things, and they focus the energy of the other planet through some kind of tool or talent. Planets primarily, relative to the signs and houses, work both directly and indirectly. That is, the direct focus of the planet being the house and sign that it is in, the direct background. The indirect background comes from the signs and houses that it rules. It has an indirect experience, like Mercury, for example. No matter where Mercury is in the horoscope, will influence everything that's happening with Virgo and Gemini and the houses that have Virgo and Gemini in the cusp. Right now, for these tests and profiles, we're only looking at the direct application of the planets. The indirect we'll get at, but we'll get at that much, much later. We could use other foci, such as cusps and nodes and parts and points and pseudoplanets and comets and pieces of junk from space and whatever we'd like, but things get very, very complex. And the other items beyond the planets are of comparatively low relative significance. In the attitude tests, we will do a little bit of looking at the ascendant and midheaven, as including them in some of the tests and profiles, but it's something that requires experience to see how they work. All right, so we have the rough picture of what we're doing. And now as we enter into the attitude tests, each time we enter into a new phase, we're faced with the same old problems, and we have to look at them all over again and see how they apply and what we derive from them. Human consciousness is extremely complex and extremely subtle. It's very hard to predict very much from a human being because there's so much there, and it's so many layers of consciousness, so many levels of consciousness. It's hard. There are natural orders between different planes of consciousness, but humans being free and humans being out of harmony with the cosmos can sometimes override the natural order of things and do things in something other than a standard or a par way of doing things. So we have to be very observant and very discerning and especially very intuitive when we make observations about things. We also have to question the basic assumptions of astrology itself. Every year, at least once, there is a session that comes up with me as to the truth of astrology and as to the recommendability of studying and practicing astrology, and then the big question, how it works. Not necessarily in a cosmological way, but how it works as a spiritual vehicle of consciousness. So there are a couple of criteria that we want to keep in mind. In order for astrology to work as a reflective representation of psychological and spiritual activity, it has to be subtle enough and complex enough to describe human character, human psychology. There are people that try to describe human character using the numbers from 1 to 10. And through all sorts of complex interrelationships with the numbers from 1 to 10, they do some pretty good vague things. But to describe the subtlety and complexity of character just doesn't come anywhere near what you do with astrology. And so something like numerology or enneagrams or things like that are inadequate, except if you're just trying to get some kind of broad picture, and then you have to know what kind of broad picture you have. After years of studying astrology and getting into the details of it, it appears to me that even using the most simple elements of astrology, the simplest of all astrology is more than adequate to describe human behavior. I say more than adequate because it can point out things that very few are sensitive to observe in themselves or others. It can show you little attitudes that maybe show up 2 or 3 times in a lifetime for 15 minutes or something like that. So astrology passes that test. One can describe things that the person whose horoscope it is may not even be able to see. I've had it happen often working with people that you describe something with the horoscope, you don't get any feedback for 10 or 15 years, and then the person comes back and says, hey, what you said was true, and it finally came out in my life, or something like that. The second thing where astrology works extremely well, the second criterion is there must be a one-to-one relationship in kind and significance between the reality and the representation of the reality. That is, if there's something significant taking place in astrology, it has to be the same kind of thing in the same degree of significance as what is happening in the person's life. Because if it isn't one-to-one, then astrology is orthogonal. It's out in left field or something like that. What we're saying is that astrology must not be spurious. It must describe all of character without omission, and the same level of significance has to be there. Now, mystical astrologers have little problem with this because they see human beings as microcosms of the greater universe. The greater universe is in us, and we are in it, and we are in form and shape, that is, in character, like the universe. So there's very little difficulty. You might say that it's a very materialistic image, but where the horoscope in the human being is something like the oil gauge in the car. It's part of the circulating system of the oil itself. It's not something that the information about the temperature of the oil or the pressure of the oil, it's not something that is inferred. It is a direct representation. See, some people look at astrology as a symbolic system. And as a symbolic system, there is not that par relationship and there is not that cosmological connection between what is done in astrology and the reality of human life. So like if we say that we are outcroppings of the same stuff that the universe is an outcropping of, and then astrology is no longer an external thing, it lives right within the system and the system lives right within, it is a more valid kind of science. But you have to be careful that because we are not clairvoyant, we are using astrology symbolically. If we were well developed with clairvoyance and we could see the effects through the desire world of astral influences on the desire bodies of individuals, we wouldn't even have to ask these questions and we wouldn't get involved with speculation as far as the meaning of symbols. All right. We're now ready to look at more kinds of tests and profiles, in this case, attitude tests and profiles. When we look at attitude tests and profiles, we're looking at signs, because the signs represent fields of attitude. We're just going to be looking at counts of planets as they're distributed through different signs or different collections of signs. But it really isn't that simple, There's always complications, and the more one assumes one knows what is going on in astrology, the more trouble one gets into. There is an ancient mystical statement that says everything is in everything. And similar things affect each other, almost like harmonics or octaves. If you hit a key on a piano, the wire an octave up from the note that you have struck also resonates. So there is a harmonic kind of relationship, so that when one thing is activated, other things are activated at the same time. It is that kind of reality. So, if we look at it, one way we can look at it, a house is a lower octave of a sign. By that we mean that in the same way that Aries is the start of the zodiac, the first house, which is a lower octave abstraction of Aries, represents the early part of life. And Leo, which is ruled by the sun, which emanates and gives itself to everything, finds in the fifth house the whole quality of giving, or the whole idea of pouring out. Like the third house represents opportunities for communicating, while the third sign represents the attitudes that are necessary for communication. Gemini, the third sign, Gemini, it represents somebody who's just filled with knowledge and data and just loves to pour facts and more facts on you, even though some of them may be trivia. Now, the tests and profiles that we're going to use are going to be very simple. We're just going to say how many things are in what kind of house and how many things are in what kind of sign. But the reality is not that way. There are overlaps, and there's no way you can put those overlaps into tests and profiles. Suppose, for example, you have a whole bunch of planets in the third house. All of those planets sense the nature of the form of communication resonates to the attitude of communication. Having a whole bunch of planets in the third house is going to have some of the qualities of being Gemini-like. And similarly, having a whole bunch of planets in Gemini is going to resonate into the third house, even though the third house in the horoscope may be empty, because certain attitudes resonate to certain kinds of forms of experience. So these are things that you have to keep in mind. Like, we can't do a test and a profile for them because we could spend the rest of our life doing tests and profiles. But when you're taking notes and you're going through this kind of test to draw these profiles, you may want to take note that if there is something of this nature going on, that it's in your consciousness, and so that later on you start finding this person having all kinds of third house experiences without any planets in the third house. You say, how do I find out what's going on here? I can see that this is this kind of activity. If you've got it in your notes that there is that resonant quality, then you can understand it. All right. This time and next time we're going to be talking about attitude profiles. And then the following time, we'll have over the long Christmas break, there'll be an assignment for everybody to do their thing, so that when we come back, I think Christmas break this year is going to be much shorter than usual. And when we come back to it, that will be all ready we'll have filled up our time away from the class with something to do. But after that, we'll do the opportunity profiles, but both the attitude and opportunity profiles are very much like what we started with, the Gestalt profiles, because they are distribution profiles. They show how things are distributed through space. So we're studying the distribution of planets in the horoscope according to various criteria. Again, we have biases. And some of the biases seem to be cosmologically intended, and others are of such a nature that we could be gypping ourselves in consciousness and thinking we know more than we really do. Because we are on Earth, we're doing geocentric astrology. That's where we're at. But the same biases that we had as far as the texture of Gestalts is concerned, those same biases apply to attitude and opportunity profiles. Because Venus and Mercury are always going to be near the Sun. This means that Venus and Mercury are much more likely to be in the sign and house of the Sun than one of the signs or houses adjacent to it. And this means that throughout astrology, there is something of a solar bias. And that's probably a necessary thing, because individuation is a very important factor. We can't do anything, and we can't really be free people unless we come into our own as individuals. This is what's so tragic about our response to the terrorist raid on New York City, and Washington for that matter. Our response has been nationalism. Everybody's identifying with a flag and with a country and our people, and that nationalism, some of our individuality is lent to the nation and is lent to the flag, and that process is called identification. And almost all forms of identification weaken the self. And right now, when we're trying to become free people, the development of the self is all important. So then it is not surprising that on Earth, where we tend to get all wrapped up in material things and such, and lose ourselves by identifying with wealth or identifying with other people or something like that, it isn't surprising that there would be a bias right in astrology that would cause us to look at things more in terms of individuation. Whether it is self or whether it is ego, that is currently the order of the day. Another bias that comes up is because our life is so short relative to the very slow-moving, the trans-Saturnian planets, we have a biased view about them. Relative to our generation, that is the people that we go to school with, that were in high school with us at the same time, and the people that we're likely to share common activities with and rise through the ranks with in our professions, all of these people are likely to share the same sign that we have for each of the octave planets. Thus, we have a built-in bias. Like the whole generation that had Neptune in Libra was biased toward, you might call that the Tolkien generation, because that whole generation loved that light fantasy of Tolkien. And all of the fantasy became a literary genre at that time. And it's because of those people. I can't think of a better description. A one-word description for Neptune in Libra would be gentle fantasy. That's actually two words. But it's that kind of a thing. So we're likely to go through life having common attitude spiritually, and we may never meet someone. It's most likely we'll never meet someone from Pluto in every sign of the zodiac. Some of us may. I have never yet met a Neptune in Taurus, a Neptune in Aries person. I've met several Neptune in Taurus people, and I don't know whether I'm going to live long enough to see Neptune get all the way to Aries. It's another 28 years, so I may not have met someone from Neptune in each of the signs of the zodiac. So you're trying to say, in one case, there's a cosmological bias. In another case, there is a bias in us just because we haven't experienced those people. And you can read biographies and you can get a sense for it. If you're clairvoyant, there's no problem. But our view of the spiritual worlds is lacking in experience, at least from an astrological point of view, because we don't get to see the whole cycle. The houses doesn't make any difference. We can see each of the planets in each of the houses, but we can't see each of the octave planets in each of the signs. All right. To repeat, attitude profiles are distribution profiles relative to the signs, which are fields of attitude. Signs are active fields of quality. They emanate myths and tones and colors. They have qualities and flavors. They're like the morals of 12 different kinds of stories. Each has a point of view, which gives it both a limitation and a specialty simultaneously. Each sign is a whole. And each, it's complete in itself. Even though it may be biased or have its own special point of view, it is a whole. And each is like an atom of the zodiac. We've mentioned it before. In close-packed geometrical structures where you have points which have position only and no size, the greatest number of points that you can pack around a common point is 12 around the 13th. You can do it with other things like ping pong balls or bowling balls or those little science balls that you get from Edmund Scientific or someplace like that. But 12 around the 13th is the maximum. So we're talking about, with three-dimensional consciousness, we're talking about the fundamental, basic points of view that are possible. But we're only looking at them geometrically when we're looking at a close-packed structure. In flat zodiacal representations, the signs are atoms which have relationships to each other into the whole. This is why we have juries of 12 people, because our founding fathers were into things like astrology and spiritual mathematics, especially in architecture, and they were interested that the government be set up until just recently on three balancing parts of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Now it is executive, and executive. Some people think it's the doctors, the lawyers, and the insurance agents. But it used to be that the mafia was part of the different powers of government also, but it doesn't seem to be anymore. But we see that there are atomic relationships of the signs to each other, even in flat space, as we represent it in a horoscope. The relations between planets or between signs indicates likes or similarities and differences. And they're all working together, just like characters in a play or notes in a scale. Some of them might sound like clinkers, or some colors might seem to clash with others, but they find their way to work even though taken by themselves, they may seem very adharmonious to each other, but they find their ways to contribute to the whole. The attitudes or the stories of creation, the myths, the relationships between them show the structure of the cosmos. This kind of attitude balances that kind of attitude. If you've ever gone through the first course that precedes this one, you see that the zodiac is a wonder for all of the balancing attitudes. It's a perfectly balanced kind of thing. Now, as things are going on in nature, in history, and in ongoing cosmology, the focus of each sign is changing all the time, because the planets are constantly changing by their movements through the signs of the zodiac. When we look at a horoscope, we're looking at a stopped activity. We're seeing just how one moment contributes to the activity of growth within the whole of things. Now, we could have astrology that took one moment and related to the next 50 years or to the whole creation if we wanted to, but that gets to be a very, very complex kind of astrology, and it's beyond my capacity to do something like that. Though historical astrology, you can do a few things of that nature. What we're attempting to do is we're looking at how an individual is born at a given moment and works in harmony with what is happening historically and cosmologically. And like in the whole changing kaleidoscope of things, we're seeing how this person or every person born at a given moment, how each of them is expressing that moment in human consciousness and waking self-consciousness on this plane. And that's it's a very beautiful thing to do. So, in order to understand that moment, we try to find the emphasis of what's happening in space and time by dividing space and counting where the foci are at any given moment and the relationships in space of those foci to get an idea of what the feel of a day is like. Each day, each hour, each moment has a feel that's all its own. I have one of my friend's father was all of his life an avant-garde jazz musician, and he entitled each piece of music Right Now. And he tried to take not necessarily the kind of harmonic structure or the composition ideas that he was working at that phase of life with, but he tried to take the moment and he tried to feel the moment and tried to express it in his jazz pieces. Unfortunately, he didn't always have people that were that, broad in their consciousness. Okay, we're doing this with regard to attitude space. We're doing this with regard to the zodiac and not to the horoscope. This kind of thing is called zodiology, when you're doing things relative to the signs rather than to the houses. So we only want to know the emphasis then between the signs of the zodiac and the structural possibilities of a given moment. Now the individual as a whole and the cosmos as a whole, and if we want to get the feel of the cosmos in a moment, or if we want to get the feel of an individual in the moment, we want to see the whole person. And we do not want to have a skewed view that gives us some kind of illusion. This means that when we do our distribution profiles, we take in the whole zodiac. Not just parts of it, the whole zodiac. And we do it in a balanced way so that we don't have an unbalanced view of things, which means that, we have, like if you're trying to run and you're carrying something on your right shoulder, it's kind of hard to run a straight line. Now, this doesn't mean that unbalanced tests and profiles are foolish, because you can get things out of them, but the kinds of things you get, they're not as generalistic. I'll give you, for example, an unbalanced profile. If you take the number of planets that you find in the signs ruled by each of the planets, so like Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. All right. If you want to count the number of planets in the signs ruled by each of them, you're going to have something unbalanced, because the Sun only rules one sign, Venus 2, Mercury 2, Moon 1, Saturn 2, Jupiter 2, Mars 2, 1, 1, 1. So how are you going to relate this to each other? You can get something important when you count the number of planets in Leo versus the number of planets in Taurus and Libra. You can get a flavor of how solar a person is versus how Venusian a person is versus how mercurial. But because each planet does not dominate the same amount of attitude space, you have something that is irregular. You learn something, but what you learn you can't relate to the whole person really easily. All right. I'm trying to say that it's not something that it isn't worthwhile, but it's something that is much more difficult to appreciate. All right. This is somewhat introductory, you realize again. With me, everything is always a new reintroduction. Next time we'll go along much faster than this, because we'll know all about attitude space, or at least. Now, we run into some of the same things with dividing space, attitude space, as we did with dividing space in general when we did Gestalt tests. We can divide space into contiguous sectors, or into balanced incontiguous sectors. We've seen some of that when we looked at Gestaltism. Contiguous space would be if all of the planets were in 1/3 of the chart. Non-contiguous space would be all of the planets in 4 balanced sectors. So the sectors are the same amount of space is in contiguous as in non-contiguous, but you get different things. Contiguous sectors are again sort of like area gestalts, and non-contiguous sectors are more like chunk style. All right, we know that much from the past. When we look at contiguous sectors from a sign perspective, that is a zodiological perspective, we find it to be much more external and much more surface-oriented, very broad. In my experience, it is not very often that the contiguous sectors are significant. When they are, they show something of a slow, gradual development of an attitude over time. The effect is very slow. We are not putting the contiguous divisions of zodiacal space into our tests and profiles because I haven't found it to be significant. I haven't found it to be helpful. And to just do something like that as an intellectual exercise would, I think, be giving a warped opinion or warped showing of what astrology is like. Sometimes it's important. We'll see that the bundle of the bucket planets of Vincent van Gogh are all in spring signs. And he very clearly has a springy attitude all the way through his character. If we look at non-contiguous sectors, we get something different. Suppose, for example, we just take one sign. Take the sign Cancer. Cancer is right in the heart of the contiguous sector that we call summer. That is from the first degree of Aries to the first degree of Libra. And therefore it represents the height of summer, where growth and fructification is at its highest. But if we look non-contiguously at the same thing, we find that Cancer is something like a fixed water sign, one of the negative signs. And what we get from that is an attitude of moodiness and an attitude of emotionality and things like that, which is altogether different than what you get if you look at contiguous signs. So for what we're going to do, we're not going to look at contiguity. We may take note of it sometimes if it appears to be relevant. At other levels of astrology, for example, if you're doing dynamic astrology, when you're dealing with progressions and transits, then it becomes important again, because it then represents seasons of events. But for right now, it isn't important. A second reason has not to do with my experience, but with the basic philosophy. It's easy to see contiguously that this is a third of the chart. It's external, it's obvious, it's right on the surface. To see that this is a third of the chart requires some intellection. You have to look and weigh and see, by golly, it is 120 degrees. And therefore, it's more internal. And internal is the very nature of the signs. The nature of the signs represent internal attitudes, where the houses represent external forms. So that's a second reason why we're only going to deal with non-contiguous sectors. All right, now let's go back and look at some of these things all over again. Some of the things that we've been looking at all along since the start of these talks, and look at them in different ways. Point space is one-dimensional space. Pythagoras, in his mathematical spiritual philosophy, says a point is being in position. Point space is mineral space, because minerals exist in position only, and they change only from something outside working on them. Two-dimensional space is linear space. Points extended into lines, and lines extended into planes. Linear space is plant space. Plants form stems, branches. It's always delineating, or roots and rootlets. Three-dimensional space is object space or volume space. Animals and humans share three-dimensional space. But there's a difference. Animals are only aware in the moment, whereas humans have time consciousness. So humans then have something of a pseudo or partially fourth-dimensional kind of consciousness with time awareness. So only humans live partially in fourth-dimensional or pseudo fourth-dimensional space. Animals have similar three-dimensional bodies, but it's always right now to them. So if we look at a horoscope, it's flat. So a horoscope is a three-dimensional and a pseudo fourth-dimensional reality that is expressed in two dimensions. So if some things get crushed down, we said just a minute ago that in three-dimensional space there are 12 directions of space, and they get packed down in two-dimensional space into 12 relationships with each other on a flat surface. In reality, in three-dimensional space, there are only 6 dimensions of the number of dots or of positions in space that you can put around one. It's always 6 around the 7th. In one-dimensional space, there's only one direction, right here. Nowhere else, right here. Now earlier we said that each of the signs is like an atom, an indivisible atom in three-dimensional or pseudo-fourth-dimensional space. So each of the signs is a complete whole, and it loses something of its character if it is broken up, if it is cut into. So if we want to understand the 12 points of view, when we do our tests and profiles, they have to include all of the signs of the zodiac, but not cut the signs of the zodiac into parts, and they have to be balanced as well as total. So we want our divisions to be contiguous. So if there are 12 atoms, it means that all of our tests have to involve factors of 12. And the factors of 12 are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 12. And they come in pairs. You would agree, right? Good to have each of these pairs represents a mathematical relationship, and it represents an astrological relationship. The 112 represents totality and atomicity. That's what we've been talking about all the time. The 2-6 represents dualism and polarity. And the 3-4 represent spiritual and material completion. Just like 3 and 4 represent, in another way, the completion of an object, or the completion of the awareness of an object. Totality and atomicity. I'm using the language, I'm being rather free with the language, but if Shakespeare can do it, I can do it. That reminds me of a joke. You want to hear a joke? Some of you have heard it from me already about Jesus and Moses are playing golf. And they come to the water hole. And Moses tees up and he goes off to the side. He's going to angle in on his next shot. And Jesus tees up and he aims straight for the pin. And Moses said, Jesus, that's a long waterway. You're not going to drive over that. Jesus said, Jack Nicholson can do it. I can do it. So he tees off, and while it goes plop in the water, he looks over to Moses sheepishly, and he says, would you? So Moses goes over, parts the water, and walks in and picks up the ball and brings it back and gives it to him. He said, I hope you learned your lesson. And Jesus puts up the ball into again and aims straight for the green again. And the same thing happens. And Moses looks over at Jesus and says, this is the last time. I'm not doing this anymore. And so he parts the water and brings the ball back. And Jesus tees up and aims right at the green again. And Moses says, you proved to yourself you can't do it. Jesus says, Jack Nicholas can do it, I can do it. He tees off and the ball goes kerplop in the water again. And he looks over at Moses, and Moses shakes his head and says, no way. He says, well, I have to do it myself. So he goes walking over the water to get the ball. He's going to reach down and pick it out. But then the next foursome is coming from behind. And they're just astounded. And they say, who does he think he is? Jesus Christ? And Moses turns and says, no, he thinks he's Jack Nicklaus. So we're playing a little bit loose with the language here. Sometime later on, we're going to talk more about the pairs as they come up. We'll have something more to say about them, but right now we won't. They represent spiritual and material completion in that order. Spiritual completion. We'll probably be talking the next time a lot about that pair. Tonight we're only going to talk about two. So our tests and profiles are only going to be about 2, 3, and 4. We'll say a few little things. And we'll talk a little bit when it's relevant about the relationship with the partners. But before we discuss, we're only going to discuss 2 tonight, and the next time we'll discuss 3 and 4, and then you'll know everything about it, and the profiling with brilliant notes will come right to you, and you'll just dive in there, especially because each of you will have read by then 2 biographies of the people, and you'll have things to be able to comment about in their life. All right. Let's put a few little aphorisms first. Number 1, each test and the consequent profile describes a unique quality that is different from each other test and profile. Number 2, it is extremely important to keep in mind what you're representing by each test and profile so that you do not confuse them with something else. In general, the centermost factors are the most important. All right, we're now ready to look. Yes, that is the 3 and 4. All right, now we're ready to get into what we're talking about tonight, and it's very little. We're down to the last page and a half of notes. All right. If we divide the zodiac into 1, that kind of division is unique because number 1 is a very unique number. Number 1 divides everything. Everything is divisible by 1. But when you divide everything by 1, it's unchanged. Meaning to say the unity of being, the unity of the existence of all things has in common one state, being. And so that's what number 1 represents. 1 itself cannot be divided by anything, at least completely, except itself. So when you're seeing a division of space, contiguous and non-contiguous space are all the same if you're doing it by one, because it's just the whole thing. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're dividing signs zodiacally or houses, because it's all one. So, to some extent, it's like seeing the whole horoscope as one. That is, the whole life as one. Some people can do that. Some people can look at a horoscope, or they can look at a life, and they can see the whole thing as one. In the same way that Mozart could look at a symphony and see it as one thing. And then when he had to delineate it to put it into movements and themes and things like that, it was a very hard thing for him, because when he had the holistic consciousness, the unity consciousness, that's very different than the delineated consciousness, which is broken down. Some people actually look at horoscopes and see all the pictures of the main events of a person's life at once, at the moment they're seeing, and not just one here and there, but the whole thing, kaboom, as if the whole moment contained all of the moments of the life at once. Now, we've already done this, because if you look at it, that's what we were doing with the Gestalts. The Gestalts was looking at the horoscope as a whole. Didn't make any difference whether we were looking at signs or houses or whatever, we were just looking at it as a whole. Okay, when we look at the horoscope in two, and we do it non-contiguously, we understand that this is going to require a different kind of consciousness. It requires some subtlety and some discrimination. When we divide it non-contiguously, the odd-numbered signs are called positive, and the even-numbered signs are called negative. So this test and profile of looking at odd or even signs, or positive or negative signs, has a long history behind it. Different people at different times in history have looked at it in different ways, and we'll now do a very brief historical synopsis of the different ways it has been looked at, because each of them gives a different slant on it, and all of them are valid. At one time, the odd-numbered signs were called active, and the even-numbered signs were called passive. This was a designation that was taken from nature, because the odd-numbered signs are fire and air signs, and the even-numbered signs are water and earth signs. And looking at it in nature, the active signs acted on the passive signs. Sun and wind drove the water and the earth, and they were passive, and they just received. Actually, there was a chain of activity in that through all four elements, in that the most active was fire, and then air, and then water, and finally the most passive was earth. So there was this whole idea then of increasing activity. Now there is truth to this. It works. So that if you look at the number of planets in positive signs and look at them as being more willing to be active, and the passive signs as more willing to be passive, there is something to that. But you have to be very careful. I don't use that distinction very much, because then you have to distinguish between the activity of odd-numbered signs and the activity of cardinal signs. Meaning that the same word is used to describe two different characters of activity. And so I don't use that too much. At another time in history, probably even more ancient, the odd-numbered signs were considered masculine, and the even-numbered signs were considered feminine. In our times, we seem to be more preoccupied with and identify with our gendered physical bodies. And because we identify with them, we're weakened by that identification. And we take insult at being called masculine or feminine. There is a kind of sexism that is there, and it's a pejorative kind of sexism. That's what the world feels, especially for women who would be associated with female bodies, and then feminine would also be associated with negativity. And you can see how people identify with, instead of the uniform spirit, which is in all bodies, if you identify with the body, this does not mean to say that those in male bodies have been fair. They've been perhaps a little too active in some sense. But a lot of people don't like being associated with the female body if the female body is associated with negativity. In this sense, because the male body has a surplus, a very vulnerable surplus in penis and scrotum, and it has an abundance in ejaculate, and it projects that, and the female body has a void, which could be considered a deficiency, or at least this is the way the philosophers looked at it, and the vagina and the womb represented that, and it received the surplus of the male to produce a union, a whole, a one. This was the idea behind this designation. And it turns out then that the odd-numbered signs were considered to be abundant and projective, and the even-numbered signs were considered to be needy or not complete in themselves, and they were seen to be receptive. And their receptivity was such that it was even a drawing kind of receptivity. Again, there is something to this. There is truth, and if you can stay away from gender bias, I think that some of the key words or some of the ideas, and I'm just mentioning some of the broadest principles here, you can take them and look at them and then look at the signs, and you can draw much more out of each of these designations than I'm giving here, because I can't be comprehensive. I can't say everything that there is. But again, this is not a total view of things, or to me it's not a representative view of things. It is in the mid to late 20th century that the odd-numbered signs came to be called positive, and the even-number signs came to be negative. Some astrologers still use the ancient designations. There was once a famous astrologer, back in the 60s, a famous astrologer that had a huge following that claimed that a man who had many planets in feminine signs was likely to be homosexual, and published that. And I thought it was completely bullshit. It just doesn't pan out. Yes?
We've done something very strange. We've associated fire and air with sun and wind, which are giant concepts. Water and earth we've associated with liquid and dirt instead of hurricane and eruption.
Volcanic eruption is driven by heat. That's again a fire. You're anticipating something that's coming at another time. You're anticipating the next talk. We're talking about something much more vague and broad than detailed states of nature.
But we've associated the cosmic with calm instead of dirt.
I don't know. This is the way that we've
Sun and wind, we've given it
fire and wind, yeah, fire and air or wind.
Sun and wind. When it comes to water and earth, we've not designated. We've just assumed it's dirt and water.
Liquids and solids.
Okay. Which is the
with regard to no. In this stream of activity that goes from fire signs down to earth signs, the amount of space occupied by energy versus the amount of space occupied by dense solid matter, it certainly is a train that goes all the way down the hill. That the greater amount of space is occupied by energy, less by gases, less still by water, and much, much less by earth. For the moment, I'll remain in the dark about that. All right. It is. We'll talk. That'll come up along the way. Okay. All right. In more recent times, we have taken up the designation of positive and negative. Now, for people who have a large number of planets in negative signs, and the word negative also has a pejorative meaning, people have found this designation to be insulting or demeaning. You can't please anybody as long as you identify with anything you can. There's something in this. It's likely that there is an optimism and an assertiveness and a can-do kind of attitude associated more with the odd-numbered signs. And the even-numbered signs are more cautious and more questioning and more matter-oriented. And they're even more withdrawing and receiving attitudes associated with them. All of those keywords work. There is that kind of truth. But again, it doesn't seem to be complete because it doesn't seem to be unified by a philosophy or a philosophical principle or a concept that works through all of them. At least the looking at it in terms of elements had a unified concept. Let's look at it one more way, in a way that is much more likely to be valuable. If we look in our conscious experience, we do find that there is something that is universal and dualistic. And it could be called, in abstract, the life cycle. Normally, the life cycle reflects or relates from when the spirit, in its pure spiritual being, decides it wants to manifest again, and it plans, and it consolidates, and it comes to birth, and it has all of the experience in this world. And then it dies, and it withdraws all of the experience, the essence of all of the experience, and impresses it as an impression. Gets the feel of it, and then it gets the meaning behind it, and then comes the grand aha conclusion of what it meant. This is what the normal life cycle is. That cycle is normally expressed in terms of hundreds of years. But the same cycle abstracted is present in everything we do, from things that are millions of years long to things that are fractions of a second long. Suppose, for example, we get an intuitive yen for a friend. So we plan a trip. We take off down the highway to visit the friend, and as we're going down the highway, somebody pulls out going from the opposite direction in what could be considered a bad pass. In a moment, we have to assess the situation. We have to observe and judge the speed. We have to get the impression of whether the other driver is just careless or a maniac or something like that. And then we measure or we think it out and we conclude in our mind, and we either hit the brakes or we swerve or do something like that, and we do it very quickly. The whole process has taken place in a matter of a very few seconds. It's a mini cycle, but the mini cycle has the same two phases. There is an introvertive phase or stage to the cycle, and there is an extrovertive stage or phase to the cycle. In one case, the person gets the data and tries to get it without a panic and get an impression of what's really going on, and then think it out and then conclude. Then a plan of action is taken, and from that plan of action, one initiates it, and there is an event. So those are the two stages of a cycle that works throughout life. Introvertive, extrovertive. The introvertive stage is more like the even-numbered signs. The extrovertive stage is more like the odd-numbered signs. Now, we don't mean to say that there aren't introvertive qualities to the odd signs and that there aren't extrovertive qualities to the even signs. We're talking more about, remember, because the signs are wholes. You just can't say one is one thing and then cancel out everything else. We're talking about the more likely or the stronger tendency of the odd number signs is extrovertive. So you can never say that one is all one way and one is all the other way. Nor are we saying that the odd number signs are extroverts and the even number signs are introverts, because that would be untrue, because that is a fixed character. And a fixed character, yes, a lot of us in our materialism do tend to have fixed character traits, and we could be typed. But when we're talking about the odd number signs and the even number signs, we're talking about a tendency, or we're talking about a characteristic, and we're not talking about a type, though sometimes there may be a type. And the final caveat is that these are not the only things in astrology that indicate introversion and extroversion. There are other things, and as we go through all of this, we'll mention other things that indicate tendencies to introversion and extroversion. Some planets are more likely to introversion or extroversion, especially in combination with certain other planets. Certain houses, for example, like the fourth house, indicates opportunities to introversion. So we want to be very clear about what we're talking about. So all of those keywords that we said, we're talking about masculine, feminine, or active and passive, or positive and negative, all of them combined together with the keywords for the introversion and extroversion and introversion, they all work. So this is a synopsis of keywords. Let's pass it out and just take just a very few minutes and look at it. There are a few things. See, what's neat about this is everybody's going to get interested in their own character all over again. And everybody's going to be digging in and looking at their character, and everybody's in their family and things like that. And it works out really well. Looking at it in terms of stages of the cycle. Oh, we don't have them all passed around yet. There may be some extras. All right, let's look down the first column pair. We're talking about relative to the object. We're not going into the Jungianism of this because that will come in an advanced class. Because we'll go into the whole psychology of introversion and extroversion and their relationship. But the positive signs are externalizing. In fact, if you want to do sun sign things, and if you look at people who become very, very popular as actors, for example, who are people who are very extroverted, you find large numbers of sun signs of positive signs, like big stars and things like that. Negative signs are internalizing. That is, the energy is taken and drawn in. Another way of saying that is that the outgoing qualities are expressive, the indrawing qualities are impressive. Using the dictionary, the positive are extroversive and the negative are introversive. Again, going right back again to the positive and negative, or the masculine and feminine, the positive are projective and the negative are reflective, or you could even say receptive. Now, the one with the question mark, the concretizing and abstracting, that's talking only about the direction. If it were a type, you would reverse them. You would say that if it were a extrovert, you would say that it was abstract. All right? The positive signs are spirit-oriented. The negative signs are matter-oriented. And we know this from going to the very simple roots of astrology. The positive signs are simplified. The negative signs are complicated. Nothing more complicated than somebody with a lot of foci in Virgo, Pisces, or Scorpio. Complication. Whereas some of the fire, like Aries is a very simplified sign. Let's have it out, you and I. That's it. It can simplified as much as can be. The positive signs are forward going and negative signs backward going. And the positive signs are delineatory. The negatives are more likely to be convoluted. Now, with each of these directions of action, there are attitudes that are attendant to them. Like if you're externalizing, you have to direct the externalizing. Whereas if you're drawing in, you have to consciously be receptive. And you can see the giving and receiving and the masculine and the feminine, and they all follow on down the line. And the consequences or the resultants of these, unfortunately I have too many negatives in there, negative in the sense, not as a contradiction to positive, but in the word, using it as a pejorative, aggressive or protective, angular, curved, impersonal or personal. These are all keywords that work, and there should be plenty of ammunition for you to be able to work on when we start doing the assignment, the tests and profiles. Like Heidi may have about 5 pages worth of notes for each one of the charts just on the odd and even number signs all alone. And that's about it. Next time we'll talk about 3 and 4, and then we'll have a nice juicy assignment to go into. That's it. These are the factors of 12 in aliquot division. 1 times 12 is 12, 2 times 6 is 12, and 3 times 4 is 12. Geez, no questions. Wow. You got another question? No, that was. Yeah. Any questions? You have some next time, I'm sure. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, and a pleasant evening.
All 12 the signs, all 30 degrees of each sign.